Good morning. I'm not going to make you share the answer to that question. Keep it personal. But I'm going to share. I'm a huffer and a puffer and a tapper when I have to wait for something. And that was like the longest 2 minutes of my life there because I just want to get started. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Rachel. I've preached once before, so it's your own fault I'm up here again because you didn't protest loud enough or long enough that I shouldn't come back up. So I'm here. So if you don't want me to come up again, you need to talk to the leadership team, okay? So we are thinking about waiting today, hence the reason why I put that question up. We're carrying on with our series, Women of the Bible. Last week, Steve looked at Eve, and this week I'm going to be looking at Sarah, sometimes known as Sarai, and very unhelpfully her husband, Abraham, then known as Abraham. So if I get them confused, can you please bear with me? I'm a teacher. I've got a week left before we finish. And I am like something out of The Walking Dead at the moment, everybody, okay? So I'm going to do my best, and the Lord is definitely going to do the rest, okay? So we're going to be looking at Sarah today, and she's part of a bigger story. And the posh word for that is a meta-narrative, everybody, okay? So part of the big picture story that we get in the Bible about God's plan for salvation. And so I'm going to be looking at her today and her part in this story, but I'm also going to be looking at the God who wrote that story. He wrote hers and he wrote mine as well. And hopefully yours too. Now, her story does span several chapters in the book of Genesis, which is the first book in the Bible. So I'm not going to read them all. I'm just going to give you an overview, like a story synopsis. So it's a bit like Jack and Ori's story time is what I'm going to give you now. So are you all sitting comfortably? Good. Okay. So we're going to do the story so we get familiar with it. Some of you might know the story, some of you might not. So that's why I think it's useful to go over it. And then we're going to see what we can pull out from Sarah's story. So we're first introduced to Sarai, because that's what she's called at the beginning, in Genesis chapter 11. And it's mentioned that she's the wife of Abraham, who we know later then becomes known as Abraham. And so they say, okay, she's his wife. And then they sum her up with this one verse, which I'll be perfectly honest is brutal. And it's not something I think people would want to see written in text about them, okay? It says, now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. Yeah? What a statement to make about somebody and have in print. Yeah? Now, thankfully, we've moved on a lot since then, but in that kind of society, in that culture, there was great shame in being childless. There was great shame in not being able to conceive. And this was before we knew all that we know about biology, and they wouldn't have known it could have had something to do with a man. It would have been the woman that would have been blamed if they couldn't conceive, if they couldn't have children. Yeah? So there's a great shame for Sarah in that message of that she was childless and that she couldn't conceive. Women's kind of worth back then was tied up in whether or not they could give their husband an heir and then plenty of backup heirs. So that throwaway line shows us just a little glimpse into kind of the shame that Sarah would have felt in the kind of culture that she was in. It then kind of talks about the fact that she went with her father-in-law Terah and her husband Abraham from Ur in the Chaldeans to go to a land called Canaan. So she left her home, she left her culture to go where her husband told her to go. It wouldn't have been like it is now, where the husband might have said, I think I've had a word from the Lord, let's pray about it together. What do you think? She wouldn't have had a choice. If he was telling her we're going, then she's going, yeah? But when they moved, just before they moved, God gave Abraham a promise, which I'm sure that he would have shared with his wife. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 2, it says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Now, at that time, if we think back to that throwaway verse about Sarai, that she was childless and that she couldn't conceive, then that promise sounds a little bit crazy, doesn't it? Yeah? But at that point, they are believing then that God can do anything. That even though now she's childless and can't conceive, that obviously God's going to make a way for that. So then, they do a little bit of traveling because there's a famine in Canaan, in the land they went to. So they go to Egypt. And Abraham there, what a stand-up guy he is when I tell you this story. He asked Sarai to lie and say that she's not his wife, that she's his sister. And the reason that he does that is because she's so beautiful that he thinks when they go there, the Pharaoh will try and kill him in order to be able to get his wife. So it's easier to say that she's his sister, because then they'll just take her to be his wife, but they won't kill Abraham. What a stand-up guy, eh? Fancy being married to him, yeah? Okay. So he is totally there, isn't he, forgetting. God just promised him that he is going to be a great nation. And he is married to Sarai, so she is part of that promise. But he basically wants to protect himself. Now, as just a little throwaway comment, it's only kind of a half lie, because Abraham is actually her half-brother. The Old Testament times were very interesting. I'm not going to go into any more detail about that. Now, he doesn't do this just once to her. He does it twice, that he asks her to lie. And both times, she ends up being taken as the wife of the ruler of the country that they go to. Yeah? So he puts his safety over her safety, over her honor. He does not protect his wife. Yeah? He is thinking about himself and protecting himself. He trades integrity for security. And look, my notes are upside down. Let me turn them. And he shows his doubt in God's ability to keep that promise, doesn't he? Because he thinks, oh my goodness, well, they're going to kill me to get to her, so let's lie. So both times, though, because God is good, yeah, God protects Sarai. So yes, she gets taken to be the wife of the rulers, but God lets the rulers know who she is, and they give her back to Abraham without any consequences, because God was going to protect them all along. So Abraham didn't need to trade his integrity at all. He could have honored his wife by saying that she was his wife instead, because God protected them. Excuse me. That's the end of term lurgy. I hope there's not too many more of those. In chapter 16, we then see that Sarai has still not borne Abraham any children. And this is approximately 14 years after the promise. The commentaries get really messy and confusing. So I'm just going to say approximately, because they can't agree. So 14 years, approximately 14 years after that first promise that they will be a great nation and a blessing to others, she still has not had a child yet. Okay? And we see that she's grown tired of waiting for God to fulfill that promise. So she comes up with her own plan. And again, Old Testament times are interesting. The plan that she comes up with is to give her maidservant to her husband so they can sleep together and make a baby that will be the heir. Yeah, not something we go around doing now, is it? Okay? But that actually was a custom at that time. That was something they would have done to ensure that there was an heir. So she gives her maidservant to her husband so they can sleep together to make a baby. Now, there would have been great shame in Sarai having to resort to that course of action. That's like a neon flashing billboard sign to everybody that you can't have a baby, and this is the way that you've got to do it. Now, Abraham, again, what a stand-up guy. Instead of gently reminding his wife of God's promise that they will be a great nation, and instead of, kindly and politely telling her to stop meddling in God's purpose and his plan and his process for the promise, he actually agrees to that plan. Yeah, all right, love, I'll sleep with your maidservant. Okay? Now, Max Lucado, I think he's going to come up now. Da-da-da. Is Max coming up? Come on, Max. There he is. What a stand-up guy. Max Lucado. I'm quite old, so I've got lots of Max Lucado books, but I think if you're a young Christian, maybe you don't read him anymore, but he is really good. So he's an American minister and writer, and he describes Abraham going along with this plan as short-sighted compromise instead of obedient faith. Yeah? So he goes along with that plan that Sarai cooks up to fulfill God's promise because they're fed up of waiting. So her maidservant Hagar becomes pregnant, and she has a son called Ishmael. Now Hagar then begins to feel like superior to her mistress because she's been able to do what Sarai couldn't. And this causes problems with her and with Sarai and between Sarai and Abraham. Now Sarai blames Abraham for the problems, and she kind of conveniently forgets it was actually her idea in the first place, yeah? But, it's his fault. I don't know about marriages, but that kind of looks like my mum and dad's marriage sometimes, It's his fault. It's not always, yeah. Now Abraham wants to stay out of it. He doesn't really want to get involved in the mess that's been made. So he just tells Sarai to do whatever she thinks best to kind of solve that problem. Unfortunately, what Sarai thinks is best is to mistreat her servant. We're not told exactly what she does, but we're told that it's enough that Hagar flees with her young son Ishmael. She runs away. Now, we're going to do more about that story next week, so whoever's doing that, don't freak out. I'm not going to say anything else, okay? So Sarai's got tired of waiting. She's come up with her own plan, and Abraham has gone along with it, yeah? It was not God's plan, yeah? It was not part of God's way of fulfilling the promise. It's just because she tried to help it along. So God then gives them another confirmation of this promise, because they've been waiting a while now for this promise to be a great nation, to be a blessing to others. And in Genesis chapter 17, he changes Abraham's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah. And he says that she will be the mother of nations. The kings of peoples will come from her. So God knows that she's got fed up waiting. And he's just reminding her, I promised, and I will do it. And then in chapter 18, which is approximately, again, because they can't agree, it's only approximately 25 years after they've got the first promise, they then get 3 visitors that come to them. It's widely believed when you read the commentaries that 2 of them were angels and 1 of them was the Lord himself. So they come to visit Abraham and Sarah. And in Genesis chapter 18, verse 10, it says, Then one of them said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son. So God has come, and he's given them a time scale now to this promise, that they've been waiting a long, long time to see fulfilled. Now, Sarah was listening in on this conversation, and she laughed to herself, as by now, even by Old Testament standards, where they lived for a really long time, she is way past the age of being able to have a child, So she laughs at that idea that God would be able to do that. It's like an inward laugh of disbelief. It's like a scoffing at the promise. I've waited this long, like that's ever going to happen now. But God heard that. Even though it was an inward laugh, God heard that, because God knows everything, doesn't he? He knows our inward thoughts and our feelings that we are too scared to voice. We wonder what people will think of us if we say them. God knows that, And he actually challenges her, because he knows that she's listening. So he says to Abraham, knowing full well that she is listening, is anything too hard for the Lord? That challenge to her. You're laughing at me, you're scoffing at the promise, but is anything too hard for me? I am God. And he repeats the promise that next year he will come back and she will have a son. Now, Sarah, at this point, she did laugh, And God calls her out for it. And he says, I heard you laugh. And guess what she does? She goes, no, I didn't. Which is quite often what we do, isn't it? When we're called out over something, we're like, oh, I didn't do that. But like I said before, God knows everything anyway. He knew that she laughed. And he knew where it came from. He knew it came from a place of pain. It came from a place of waiting that was really difficult, from a place of doubt and distrust and disbelief. He knew that. He also knew that she felt like a failure because that promise hadn't happened. And he also knew that she had taken that matter into her own hands and tried to fulfill the promise. God knew that she'd made an almighty mess when she did that she caused problems for herself, for her husband, and for Hagar and for Ishmael. God knew that. He knew that she'd made a mess. But he was still there, turning up and telling her that the promise is going to happen. And he gave her a time scale for that. And then in Genesis chapter 21, we get these absolutely fantastic verses. In verses 1 and 2, here we go. It says, Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. And she called her son Isaac, just as God had asked, which means one who laughs or rejoices, because he was certainly something to rejoice over. So that is a very brief overview of the story of Sarai/Sarah. What a story, eh? You probably all sat there thinking, why on earth did the leadership team pick her to be a woman from the Bible that we're going to learn from, Because quite frankly, she's a liar, isn't she? She's bitter, she's dishonest, she's mean, she's controlling, and she's full of doubt and distrust. Not really an example right there, is she? But thankfully, I'm not talking about her really, am I? I'm talking about her God, my God, and hopefully your God. And then I'm going like this. Where's my notes gone? Okay. I knew this would happen to me at some point, that now I don't know what page. Because you know what I didn't do? I didn't number them. Oh, no. So, let's have a little look. Where has it gone, everybody? Well, I'm just going to carry on. I'm going to say, well, thankfully, that I am not talking, there we go, about her, but about her God. We're talking about how he can use us in our frailty, in our fallenness, and in our failure. So out of this story, I want to draw 3 ideas. They do not start with the same letter. Lois, I'm trying to emulate you and it's not working. So maybe next time if you let me up, I'll try and get 3 things that start with the same letter. But I do have 3 things that are focused on God as our promise giver and our promise keeper and how we can respond to him. So the first one is, with our promise giver and keeper, there is grace and there is mercy. Yeah? And it's not based on who we are, and it's not based on what we've done, but it's based on who God is and what God has done. Amen, yeah? So a simple explanation of grace is the idea that God gives us what we don't deserve. My old pastor used to say, God's riches at Christ's expense. Yeah, we get everything that God has given Jesus, that we get it, and we don't deserve that. And then mercy, again, simply put, is God not giving us what we actually do deserve. Yeah? With God, there is grace and mercy. God took someone who definitely was not worthy, yeah? Who was a liar, who didn't trust him. Excuse me, that's only 2. I'm doing all right. Who doubted and who created her own schemes and got in the way of what God had, yeah? And he uses her in that meta-narrative, in that big picture of salvation, yeah? Because we read of Sarah's son in the genealogy, the family tree of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, it says, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And Abraham was the father of Isaac. And let's not forget who his mum was. Sarah was the mother of Isaac, wasn't she? Sarah was part of God's amazing plan to send his son into the world to save us, yeah? Even though of who she was, it's nothing to do with her. It's to do with God's grace and God's mercy, and he can use us. So Max Lucado again. I do like Max Lucado. He was very useful in this preach, was Max Lucado. He says, no matter how much we foul up, God's plan of salvation is never thwarted, and his grace is never threatened. Yeah? So we can mess up, but God knows, and God uses that, and God works through that, and it does not get in the way of what he has got for us and what he has got for his people. Now I've got to find the right notes again. Now we're on number 2. That was handy because it says 2 on top of the page, so I found it. Okay. Point number 2 is then, with our promise giver and keeper, things always happen at the right time. Yeah? Not necessarily when we would like them to happen. Yeah? I is not very good at waiting. Not at all. Okay? They don't necessarily happen to our plan or in the way that we would have thought it should do, but it does happen at the right time. God doesn't need an alarm clock or a note on his phone to remind him about the promise and how he's supposed to fulfill it and when it's going to happen, because he is all-knowing, he's all-loving, he's all-powerful, and he's all-present. He will do it when it is the right time. In 2 Peter 3, verses 8 to 9, it says, with God, one day is as good as 1,000 years, 1,000 years as a day. God isn't late with his promises, as some measure lateness. Now, that is really difficult to grasp. We are not patient people. I didn't get you to share, but I bet most of you aren't patient, are you? Okay? It's actually a fruit of the Holy Spirit, that, so we've all got to work on that, yeah? Okay? But we're not patient, and especially in this kind of day and age where everything just happens like that. It's difficult to wait for something. Now, Sarah waited approximately 25 years for that promise to be fulfilled, that she would be the mother of a great nation. And I don't know, maybe sitting here, how long you might have been waiting for a promise. But what I want you to understand today is that God has not forgotten. If he gave you that promise, it will happen at the right time and in the right way. I'm stealing from Lois's preach a couple of weeks ago, and she talked about the fact that there's a plan and there's a process to go through for promises to be fulfilled. And God knows that. He knows the plan and he knows the process, and he will fulfill that promise. And then point number 3, I'm nearly done. I'm lying, I'm not nearly done. It's just so that if you were fed up of waiting, I gave you a bit of hope, but I've taken it away now. I'm still going. Okay, number 3, in the waiting, we need to focus on the promise giver and the promise keeper and not the promise itself. When we look at Sarah's story, we can do a lot of kind of surmising that maybe she felt like this. So this is kind of me going, I think this is kind of what happened. I think she got caught up in the promise itself and the practicalities of how that was going to get fulfilled. And I think the more that she thought about that, remember that throwaway verse about her that she couldn't conceive, that she was childless. The more she thought about that, the more doubt crept into her mind. Well, how's that going to happen? Because I can't conceive, because I'm childless. And the more she thought about that, the more distrust crept in as well. And she got fed up then and disillusioned in the waiting. She's thinking, I'm really old now. There's definitely no chance that it could be fulfilled. And then that's why she kind of went her own way and did her own thing to try and help God out. I think in that waiting, she missed the opportunity to draw near to the promise giver and the promise keeper. She missed the opportunity to receive him, because she even laughed at him and doubted him when he came back again and told her, definitely this is going to happen in a year's time. Yeah, she didn't meet God in the waiting. And I think she missed out on a lot of blessing in that. She missed out on what God could and would have given her as she waited with him. She was more concerned with receiving the promise, with the practicalities of the promise, than receiving the promise giver himself. In Isaiah 40, verse 31, it says, those that wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. There can be joy in the wait. There can be renewed faith and strength and purpose and a steadiness in our walk, but only if we keep fixed on the promise giver and the promise keeper, not the promise itself. So for us today, what I kind of want us to reflect on, I am definitely nearly done now, I promise. Okay, those were the three main points, and then this is kind of what we can reflect on and think about. First of all, I want us really to be strengthened in our faith in the promise giver, being assured of God's grace in our stumbling, God's faith in us when our faith, I can't get me words out, faith, that's the word I'm trying to say, when our faith wavers, God's mercy when we decide to go our own way, and God's love for us when we are fearful and when we distrust and when we doubt. God is good. He used Sarah, and she was a liar. She was full of doubt and distrust, and she laughed at the promise giver. And if he used her in his big picture of salvation, he can use me and he can use you. And he will. Not just he could, he will use you. And secondly, I kind of want to give us a chance to reflect, to be challenged about our faith in the promise giver and the promise keeper. How do we wait for God's promises? Yeah? It could be a specific promise that you're waiting for. And I would just say, just a little rider on this, and it could be a whole nother sermon, which I won't give, but somebody else can. We need to be really careful with promises. We need to make sure they come from the promise giver. Not that they come from some well-meaning individual that says, I think God's got this for you. Yeah? We need to check, what does the Bible say? What does my heart say? What do other people that know and love me that are praying to it, what do they say? I've got a wonderful, wonderful friend, and she told me a story, which I will get totally wrong. I get all the facts wrong because I only remember half the things people tell me. But she's a wonderful woman of God. I think she's about 60. I think that might be wrong. And she got told in her 20s by a very well-meaning pastor that she'd be married by the end of the year. This wonderful, wonderful woman of God is not married at 60, but the stuff she has got done for her promise giver and her promise keeper is amazing. She never once took that promise to be solid, yeah? She just said, well, God, whatever you've got for me, you've got for me. And she's still single now. And she ministers to single women like me and encourages us to know that our identity is not in that. It is in God, yeah? And if she'd have held fast to that one well-meaning person's promise, I don't know where her life would have ended up. But she held fast to the promise giver and keeper, not the promise. So just a little rider there. If you're waiting for something, please make sure it was God that gave you that promise. Because if it was, he will fulfill it. He will do what he said. So how can we wait well? How can we kind of watch out for stumbling as we wait for God's promise, ensuring that we stay in a place of faith? And I think we do that by fixing our eyes, don't we, on the promise giver and the promise keeper, of reminding ourselves who he is. I give my preachers to my wonderful dad, who is an incredibly godly man and a very good preacher, by the way. Maybe one time he might come up here, I don't know. He's getting a bit old now, maybe don't want to do that. So I gave him my preacher, said, Dad, please read it over, make sure it's not blasphemous, really. That's what I'm going for, make sure it's not blasphemous. So he read it and he just said, Rachel, it's great, because he's very affirming, is my dad. He said, but as I was reading it, he said, this psalm just kept coming to me over and over again. So he said, I hope you don't mind, have a think whether you should put that in. And he's so right, It was from God, my dad. It's from God. And it's Psalm 13. You might be familiar with it. The psalmist has a repetitive refrain that goes through that psalm, and it is, how long, Lord? And you can hear that anguish, and you can hear the pain in that repetitive refrain. How long, Lord? And it might not just be about waiting for a promise. This particular one is about waiting to be rescued from a situation. Maybe you're waiting for that. There is pain in the waiting, and God knows that. He knows it's hard. He knows that things can get in the way. And that repetitive refrain goes through that psalm all the time. How long, Lord? And then in verse 5, right at the very end, but. There's a great big but, and I'm going to say nothing else, because I think I used that line the last time about buts. Oh dear. There's a great big but, and it says, but I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. We can still cry, how long, Lord? And still acknowledge that he is good, that he will fulfill the promise. So my prayer kind of for all of us here today is that we would wait well for whatever it is that we're waiting for, that we would continue to trust and rejoice and praise and rest in the goodness of our promise giver and keeper as we wait.